It was the best Halloween party I've ever had. It traumatized me for life. It was such an incredible party. Genuinely, if I had to pick out the most happy and wonderful moments of my life, that Halloween party would have been one of them. That's why it hurts so much to remember it. It makes me want to break down crying whenever I think about the terrible, awful thing that happened right under our noses, and how none of us even noticed. It feels so obvious, looking back on it now. Hindsight is 20/20, I suppose. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly unsocial person. I think I get along with people quite well once I've gotten to know them. But something about making that first step of initial contact just always seems so difficult. I always felt incredibly awkward being introduced to strangers, and while I can mask that discomfort fairly well, it does mean that I tend to adopt a slightly stilted and formal attitude whenever I'm meeting new people. As a consequence, and also in part due to the pandemic, much of my socializing for the past few years has been online. The awkwardness is still there, of course, but it feels so much less uncomfortable when the people I'm being introduced to are just text on a screen. However, this does mean that most of my friends tend to live quite far away. A handful of them do live within about an hour's drive of me, so we tend to hang out whenever possible, at least we used to before the party. Nowadays it just feels wrong. It was on one such meetup with 3 friends of mine that we discussed the possibility of throwing a big party of some sort. We all navigated the same general social circles, and we had considered for a while inviting down the myriad online friends we had acquired over the years, at least the ones we trusted. It was I who suggested we host the party on Halloween. From there the discussion swiftly turned to themes, since what kind of Halloween party wouldn't have a theme? Jessica suggested that we host something inspired by mythology and ancient history. She had always been quite interested in legends, myths, and classical literature of all kinds, and I recall fondly our discussions of Beowulf, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. As much as I would have liked to indulge her, the others pointed out it could be somewhat of a niche topic, and so the discussion continued. Sadie, Jessica's girlfriend, suggested something themed off of horror films. Sadie had, partially at my encouragement, been on a bit of a horror movie kick as of late, and we had all enjoyed spending time rewatching some of the old classics together. It seemed like a solid theme, and Jessica and I were almost set to agree on it, but it was then that Jake suggested his idea. In any given queer friend group, there is typically one straight member who has been deemed safe by the others. Jake was that friend. We all considered him trustworthy and never really had to worry about him putting his foot in his mouth whenever the conversation veered towards a rainbow hue. I had half expected Jake to suggest a historical theme, given his degree in military history, but instead he advised that we go for a traditional sort of Halloween party, bobbing for apples, carving pumpkins, that sort of thing. The rest of us immediately agreed this would be the best course of action. Not only would it mean that none of the attendees would have to adjust their costumes for the occasion, but also none of us had ever actually attended such an event, and the novelty of something simultaneously nostalgic yet alien was the perfect combination. Instantly there was discussion of activities, decorations, and whether or not we should pool together our funds to get a fog machine. Now, obviously the 4 of us didn't plan out the entire party in one night. We still had to figure out who we trusted well enough to give Jessica's address to. It was decided early on that her house would be the most suitable for hosting, sent out invitations, and even put up a couple of online fundraisers to try and get plane tickets for some of our more distant friends. Over the months that this process took, we soon found that what had started out as mere idle discussion was rapidly taking shape into what seemed would be a rather excellent celebration. Now, each of us were to contribute some sort of activity that we would watch over and purchase the necessary supplies for. Sadie's medical background gave her the rather ghoulish idea of setting up a pumpkin carving table themed after an autopsy, which, while strictly speaking wasn't traditional, fit so well with the whole aesthetic of the party that we all found it delightful. Jessica said about acquiring an old-style wooden barrel for the purpose of bobbing for apples, putting her artistic skills to good use with paintings of various Halloween spooks on the sides of it. My idea was somewhat silly but still wound up being put to use. I couldn't find if the game had a real name, or if it was just called the mirror game, but I'd heard it alleged that if you stared at your own face in the mirror for long enough your mind would distort the image in a rather frightful manner. So I was going to set up the bathroom with candles and a chair, the lights turned off. Jake decided he was going to set up a game of Dead Man's Brains. If you've ever read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, you've probably heard of this game. You set up a series of boxes with bits of cloth loosely covering the opening, and place within each box some nasty object that feels like the body part of a dead man. Peeled grapes for eyes, a bowl of diluted ketchup for blood, a mushy tomato for the titular brain, etc. There was a sort of pseudo-poem that was supposed to go along with it, but Jake didn't really care to stick too close to the traditional version. He said he would put his own twist on it. We all thought it was a great idea, and that it fit the theme perfectly. Jake even went about making some custom boxes for the affair, each labeled with the body part in question, deciding that his version would consist of eyeballs, guts, heart, fingers, and of course, the titular brains. The months until the party turned into weeks, then days, until finally it was time for the night itself. I arrived early, along with Sadie, so we could set up our activities in advance of the guests, but Jake was nowhere to be found. We texted him, but received no response, which was a bit worrying, but we tried to work around it, assuming that something had come up that was occupying his attention for a bit. In terms of costumes, Sadie and Jessica had decided to go as Carmilla and Laura from Carmilla. We had recently watched the film Dracula's Daughter, which was loosely inspired by the novella, and while the film itself was so-so, it had inspired the two of them to read the source material, which they quite enjoyed. Given Sadie's relative short stature in comparison to Jessica, it was somewhat amusing to observe a Carmilla who would need a step stool in order to successfully suck out her victim's blood. As for me, I had chosen to dress as the witch Keziah Mason from Lovecraft's tale Dreams in the Witch House. It was a simple matter of getting some Puritan-esque clothes, a ragged gray shawl, and a small toy rat with the bearded face of an action figure swapped for the head. All in all, I thought the effect was rather good, though I didn't go to the effort of attempting to age myself with makeup. Jessica's apple bobbing station and Sadie's pumpkin autopsy table were set up quickly, and I went about preparing all the necessary alterations to the bathroom. At this point, the first guests were expected to arrive, and we were all growing increasingly concerned by Jake's continued absence. We tried calling him, but were directed straight to voicemail. Of the four of us, Jake was usually the most punctual, so this was a very strange change of character. We decided we would have to start without him, not that we had much choice in the matter. As soon as we had said this, our first guests began to pour in. Our first visitors of the evening were Ashley and Dawn, fresh from their honeymoon in British Columbia. Dawn seemed dressed like something out of a World War II propaganda poster, with a plaid shirt and open welding mask. Ashley's costume seemed to be a character out of some cartoon or video game which I wasn't familiar with, pink hair in a punk style with large mechanical boxing gloves of some sort. Regardless of my unfamiliarity with the subject matter, the costume did seem to be quite well made, and despite the lack of matching with regards to their costumes, the two of them made quite the cute couple. We had only just managed to finish introductions when Sock and his boyfriend arrived next. Sock is quite the artist, with talents in more mediums than I can count, one of those people who is less a jack of all trades and more a master of all trades. It seemed he had turned his artistic skills towards papier-mâché most recently, as the costume he wore seemed primarily made using the technique. It was some sort of monstrous beast, all fangs, claws, and scaly skin, and though it was quite impressive, I couldn't quite discern if it was meant to reference something else or if it was an original creation of Sock's. Sock's boyfriend, whose name I can never recall, simply wore a cheap mad scientist outfit, complete with goggles and long black gloves. He was a rather short, anxious gentleman, a mycologist by trade if I recall correctly, and while he did seem to enjoy himself as the evening progressed, he tended to just hover around his boyfriend nervously. Next came Carlos and Elizabeth, the two of them sharing a ride to save money. Both had just landed after extremely long flights, Carlos from Brazil and Elizabeth from France, and it was clear from their bleary eyes and occasionally spacey looks that they were jet-lagged to hell and back. Carlos hadn't really had time to get any sort of costume ready, so simply wore some nice tweeds and a sign hanging from his neck reading "I am a human puppet." Elizabeth meanwhile had managed to put on some clown makeup. In spite of their tiredness, the two of them seemed to perk up quite quickly, as this was the first time any of us had the opportunity to meet up in person with them, and our enthusiasm was infectious. Second to last arrived Astra, clad in the garb of a Napoleonic soldier, and I knew even without asking that every aspect of the uniform was sure to be as accurate as possible. Within minutes of her arrival, Astra, Carlos, and Elizabeth were instantly locked in conversation regarding the intricacies of lightweight tabletop role-playing game design, a topic they continued to discuss for much of the party. Finally, after every other guest had long since made their way to the party, did Jake show up. There was a knock upon Jessica's thick wooden door, and since everyone else was otherwise occupied in conversation, I went to answer it. I found myself standing face to face with a gas-masked infantryman of the Great War, complete with Brody helmet and a replica Webley revolver which I lent him. Next to him were a series of wooden boxes. I greeted him with a hug, which he responded with silently and stiffly. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. He pressed a piece of folded-up paper into my hand, which I read immediately. It said, "Sorry for being late. Couldn't find the card for the train. I've got a cold and I've lost my voice. I'll probably have to leave early, but I figured I should at least show up as long as I can. Would have told you earlier, but my phone stopped working. I think the battery gave out." I apologized profusely for the hardships he had experienced and ushered him into the house to the cheers of our friends, carrying the boxes he had brought for him. Each box was made of dark-stained wood with an opening covered in black cloth, with a label burned above the opening stating which body part was contained within each one. It was really quite impressive, and I complimented Jake on his handiwork, to which he simply nodded. I helped him set up the game of Dead Man's Brains on the table we had set aside for it, and the rest of the party continued as planned, though the distinctive absence of Jake's voice was noticeable. Everything about the party was perfect. Legitimately, I do not think I have ever had a happier occasion in my entire life. There was laughter, jokes. At some point or another Ashley and Dawn broke out some card games. Elizabeth ran a quick session of a horror TTRPG of her own design. It was a truly magical evening. The theme of the classic Halloween party didn't go unobserved either. Plenty of time was spent bobbing for apples, staring into the mirror by candlelight, though it did admittedly devolve into chanting of Bloody Mary rather quickly, carving pumpkins, and everyone in the party adored Jake's rendition of Dead Man's Brains. He accepted each compliment with a polite nod and a tip of his helmet. There were 5 boxes, labeled eyes, guts, fingers, heart and finally, brain. I've always been somewhat squeamish when it came to rotten fruit, raw meat and other such inedible foodstuffs, and what I felt in those boxes quickly triggered that latent disgust. I only managed to get to guts before I had to dip out, laughingly explaining that I would vomit if I had to undergo the whole thing. There were many jokes about me being a pussy, but I wasn't pressured into doing the rest of it. We had already planned to make the party into a sleepover, since we didn't expect anyone to shell out the money for a hotel. As the evening wound down, out came the air mattresses and pillows. As soon as it was clear that the more active part of the evening was coming to a close, Jake quietly excused himself, handing a note to Jessica thanking her for hosting the party. We all gave our fondest farewells to him, each of us hugging him in turn, and he left with a final wave and a cheerful salute. We all slept soundly that night, happy from the company of friends and tired from a night of childlike, innocent fun. It was such a perfect party, and despite what I know now, I still find myself reliving that night over and over in my head, remembering how happy and content I felt. Everything changed in the morning. I had woken up earlier than usual, nose wrinkling due to an unfamiliar stench. I got up to investigate, more intent on getting rid of it so I could go back to sleep than getting up for the day proper. The smell came from the boxes, a rotten, sickly odor. The scent of meat just beginning to spoil. I remember mentally kicking myself for not reminding Jake to take them with him when he left. I put on a pair of rubber gloves and reached inside, trying not to gag. I started with the box labeled eyes. I must have woken up the whole neighborhood with my screaming. The police were there within 15 minutes to take our testimony. They kept asking everyone for a description of the suspect, what he looked like, and we just had to shake our heads and tell them we didn't know. That we couldn't tell who he was underneath the gas mask. Hell, we didn't even know if he was a he. We didn't see their face after all. They took the eyes, the intestines, the severed fingers, the heart, and the severed head with the top of the skull neatly removed as evidence, but I imagine Jake's family were swiftly given custody of the remains shortly afterwards. It's not like forensics would be able to get any usable fingerprints off of them, given how many of us had touched them. Halloween night. My friends and I were too old to go trick-or-treating, but that didn't mean we stopped going. The adults always frowned at us when they opened their door and saw our Fab Five group waiting with open bags to put candy into. We heard the same line of questioning at almost every house. Aren't you too old to be doing this? This year, Jace prepared a monologue and told the adults that this was our last year. He fed them a sob story about an imaginary younger brother that passed away too soon. Jace was, in fact, an only child. After the 6th house this happened at, I spoke up. I don't want to trick or treat anymore, I said, hesitantly. We don't even eat the candy. Are you too good for us now? Dara glared at me. Her raven hair was cut into a vicious-looking bob that made her look intimidating. No, that's not it, I stammered. I was never any good at standing up to my friends, and this was why I normally kept my mouth shut. Then what is it? Parker crooned. He was my weakness, and everyone, including him, knew it. His brown eyes and mischievous smile made me weak. These are kid games, I whispered. We barely made the effort to dress up. Listen to Alice, Amber taunted. It is kind of childish. What else did you have in mind? She directed the question at me, and I knew what she wanted me to say, even though I just as equally didn't want to do that either. What about haunted houses? I inquired, feeling everyone's intense gazes. Amber and I had talked about it a couple of days ago. She convinced me it would be fun and that our friends would love it, too. The gleam in her eyes told me that I had said the right thing. Haunted houses, huh? Jace mused. You know, Amber replied, as her red hair danced in the fading glow of twilight, I think I may have heard about a house that goes all out every year. Always eager to take charge, Jace acted like he knew the place. I've heard of that one, he declared with a wicked grin. The story goes that the location changes every year. Supposedly, a rich family goes from state to state looking for the creepiest houses they can find, buys it, then spends the entire year leading up to Halloween renovating it. It's how they make a living. I'm in, Dara leered, wanting her night out with Parker to continue. I'm in if Alice is, Parker promised and stared at me in a way that would make me agree to anything. I quickly nodded as words failed me. Great, Amber exclaimed as she took Jace's arm, smiling up at him. We'll lead the way. Dara and Parker followed in step, and I drug up the rear, as usual. My friends' relationship with each other seemed to be purely for pleasure and entertainment. Jace and Amber were your typical jock and cheerleader disaster, which coincidentally, is how they dressed up this year. Parker was on the basketball team with Jace. He never dated anyone, but was always seen with someone new. It was easy to understand why, since I desired him the same way every other female at our school did. His big, bad wolf costume was not far from the truth. Dara was Parker's new toy. She was the dangerous type who hung out with the goth crowd. Our classmates all believed she was a witch. She had a piercing stare that made your blood run cold. That's probably what drew Parker to her. A fun conquest. I tagged along with Amber. We had been friends since grade school, and I was always the person she ran to when she needed someone to hang with. I was more of her excuse than anything. I often got left behind while she snuck off with a guy, or used as the reason she left a party early when it was lame. I really didn't mind most of the time. At least someone knew who I was. There it is. Jace beamed with a twisted grin. Amber danced with excitement. Whoa, I blurted as my body froze up. For once, Parker looked apprehensive. Don't worry, love, I saw Dara whisper in Parker's ear. I'll protect you. He shifted his gaze from her, all dolled up in her little Red Riding Hood outfit, and back to the house that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The house stood 2 stories high with a wraparound porch that had heavy, iron chains dangling all the way around it. The windows had bars on the inside, as though they were trying to keep something in, instead of out. I was scared we would never escape if we set foot in that place. I walked a little toward the side of the house to see if it had an exit somewhere. I halted when I saw the lawn decorations. I stared incomprehensibly at the girl that was cut open and tied to a post, revealing the inner workings of the human body. Propped up like a scarecrow with her arms spread out to either side, blood caked her hair and face. She was unrecognizable. Her intestines spilled out of her body and oozed onto the grass below her. Her costume was ripped to shreds, revealing torn-up flesh. She wasn't the only one there, either. There were 2 more people placed throughout the yard. They were boys around our age. They hadn't been in costumes, just band t-shirts and jeans that dripped with blood. How could anyone see this and think this house was safe to go into? I let out a scream as a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. I turned to see who it was, and a giant man stood before me. His stringy hair hung over one eye as the other abnormally large one jutted out from his head. He was missing teeth and his fingers had long, yellowing nails. I stepped back, but fell over my own feet and heard my friends laughing behind me. I pulled my dress back down as I stood. It was the same costume I had worn nearly every year, Alice in Wonderland, cliché, but I liked it. The man that had frightened me stepped away with his hands up, showing that he intended me no harm. "I'm terribly sorry if I frightened you," he said. "I'm Mr. Myers. I saw you admiring the decorations and I wanted to assure you that they are fake. We've had a lot of people afraid to come up to the door tonight. I think we outdid ourselves this year. I think they're great." Dara laughed and walked right up to one. She put her hand in the intestines, and when she drew it back out, the brownish-red substance was pulling away with it. "It's even warm like blood," she confirmed. She kneaded the goo in her hand before Mr. Myers handed her a towel to wipe it off. "We don't like the props to be touched. That's why the signs are up," he announced with a warning in his voice. There were indeed signs up around the yard telling people to stay on the path and not to touch the decorations. I shrank back a little, realizing I broke the rules first. "Are you interested in walking through the house?" Mr. Myers asked our group. "Hell yes." Jace cheered and walked toward the door with Amber close behind. Parker helped me up from the ground and Dara shot me a death glare. My nerves were on edge, as everyone else bounced with excitement. That body looked way too real and the girl looked familiar, too. It couldn't be real, though. It was a haunted house and people flocked to it. If anyone had really gone missing, mutilated, and hung out for display, the police would know by now, even in this part of town. "It's $10 each, which is non-refundable," Mr. Myers said. "Some people don't find this house up to their level of scare, but my wife and I work all year round to make the house as special as possible for one day. All of the money earned goes toward next year's house." Mr. Myers gave me a warm smile. He was very polite and easygoing, even if the makeup he wore was a bit creepy. After collecting the money, he walked us into the main entrance. It was a large, circular area that had 3 paths laid out before it. One went upstairs, the second stayed on this level, and the third led to a basement. Each path was painted in yellow bricks that were dimly lit. Before you choose which path you take, you have to hear the house rules. We take these very seriously, so it's important that you follow them. It's all for your own safety. My friends were barely listening to him as their excitement overtook them. Jace and Amber were eyeing the upstairs and talking excitedly as they playfully touched one another. Dara was running her fingers over the bars of the window and glancing down the path that led to the basement. Parker's eyebrows knit together, as he watched Dara's eyes light up with glee at the sight of a whip that hung on the wall, as though he second-guessed his decision to ask her on a date. Mr. Myers didn't look at all surprised, so he focused his attention on me as I waited patiently to hear the rules. I did not like breaking rules, especially in someone else's house. "First, you will have to sign a waiver saying if anything happens to you on this property, we, the owners, cannot be held responsible as you entered on your own free will." He passed out papers which everyone eagerly signed. "Are you reading that?" Jay scoffed. "Sign the papers, Alice. He already told you what it says." I glanced up at Mr. Myers to see him smiling. My friends were all huffing their impatience with me, so I signed it and handed it back. "Do not step outside of the path that is marked for you. I cannot stress this enough. There are things in this house that should not exist in this world, but are allowed to travel here on Halloween night. They are restless, they are hungry, and they are without a conscience." I swallowed hard and glanced at my friends who had a gleam in their eyes as though this was all part of the act. I didn't get that feeling. To me, It felt like he was warning us, and that message only sunk in deeper as his eyes bore into mine with a pleading look. There are weapons you can take with you to protect yourselves if you do get caught out of bounds. I could feel the terror showing on my face as he walked over to a bin full of weapons. Don't worry, they're only props until you need them to be something more. He winked right before he showed us how bendy the plastic pitchfork was. You are going to want this one, he asserted as he handed it to me. It has a long reach, so it'll keep things at more than arm's reach from you. I took it. It was long and awkward, but it made me feel a little safer, even if it was only plastic. Go ahead and find your weapons. He nodded to the rest of the group. My friends went to the bin and sorted through it. Parker found a sword that looked like real metal in the light. He slashed it around a couple of times as he tested it out. Dara picked out a utility belt that had a wooden stake, a dagger, a butcher's knife, and a grappling hook on it. She tied it around her waist and played with all of the toys by pulling them out one by one and making stabbing motions. She wasn't sure what to do with the grappling hook, so she tossed it off the belt. Jace had decided to take a baseball bat. No surprise there, since that was his favorite sport to play. Amber had grabbed a long staff that had a point on one end and began twirling it. Again, very cliché, as she was a cheerleader who twirled a baton. I decided to stick with a pitchfork. If Mr. Myers had told me it was the best for me, then I would not question him. Good, you all seem like you've got the hang of this. Your goal is to make it out of the house. It has been constructed in a maze-like pattern, so you'll have to use your wits to find your way out. The exit is located in the basement, but the basement is not the true way to reach the door. There are trapdoors and hidden staircases that you have to find in order to get to the correct part of the maze. There are clues hidden throughout the house to help you find your way out as well. Pay attention to them. At the mention of the trapdoors, I picked up the grappling hook Dara had tossed aside and put it in my dress pocket, just in case. Mr. Myers gave a small nod at me that no one else seemed to notice. My wife will be at the exit door dressed up as a white witch. That's how you'll know you've made it. The exit will lead you out the back of the house, into an alleyway that you can take to get back to the main road. Once you are out, there is no coming back in. It's best if you don't wait for your friends at the back door. Follow the path to the road and wait at the stop sign for them. Any questions? My friends had stopped paying attention halfway through his speech, but I hung on every word. I didn't have any questions other than what the fastest route to get out was. I didn't think he would answer it. You were going down, Parker. Jace sneered. I'll be waiting for you outside, Jace, Parker retorted. Amber squealed with delight as this had now become a competition. All right. If there are no questions, then good luck, Mr. Myers said as he walked to the front door and bolted it shut. Jace and Amber ran up the stairs, hand in hand, and giggling the entire way. Parker and Dara walked the dark path that led to the basement. As usual, I was left alone, except for Mr. Myers, who was still standing there waiting for me to make a move. He subtly pointed forward toward the main level of the house, and I graciously took the hint. The walkway was dimly lit, but I didn't have a problem following the path. The yellow paint's reflective glow was bright enough for me to spot. Step after step, I became more afraid when nothing jumped out to scare me. There was something unsettling about the house. Maybe it was thinking about that girl outside that looked too lifelike, or maybe it was the caution from Mr. Myers that these weapons were only plastic until we needed them to be something more. Whatever it was, I hated the fact that my friends had left me alone. They probably didn't give me another thought as they raced off to beat each other out of the house. I was always in the back of people's minds. This may have been my idea, but it was an idea Amber had planted in my head, knowing I would say what she wanted. Why was I such a sheep? A light flicked on, pulling me out of my downward spiral of thoughts. It revealed a living room area that had a small couch and chair facing a television. Each cushion was worn and molded as though sculpted to the person who sat there day after day. Brown bottles littered the floor by the chair. One of them was broken with liquid coming out of it. The place smelled of cigarettes as smoke wafted from a freshly lit one that was perched on an ashtray. The windows behind the couch were boarded up and painted black. "Where's my dinner?" A rough male voice growled from nearby as he slammed his hand down on something hard. A new light popped on, hovering over a kitchen table that was lined with plates of half-eaten food. I carefully continued down the path, looking around for the man that spoke, and felt something squish under my black, slip-on shoes. The floor was covered in squirming maggots. My breathing became ragged. Why did it have to be maggots? They only meant one thing: something dead was nearby. I scanned the table and found the source of where the maggots were spilling out from. A lifeless body of an older woman was contorted with limbs in a defensive position and head thrown back, searching for a god that didn't exist. The maggots came out of every slash that was made across her body. A man with a pudgy belly that rested over the table was leering at me. His smile widened as my face filled with horror and disgust. My breathing came out in rapid, shallow gasps as the panic rose in my body. I backed away and into a something solid that shook the contents inside of it. I turned around to see what I hid and found more horrors waiting for me in a cabinet made of glass. It held jars of human organs that were carefully preserved. Blue eyes stared back at me from a clear jar. On the shelf above, a brain sat in a large jar. Below the eyes were a heart and a pair of lungs. Intestines threatened to bulge out of its container. Sprinkled on the shelves were other parts like fingers, toes, and an assortment of bones. "Like what you see?" The voice crooned at me. "I made it myself. I've been searching for the perfect person my whole life, but I never found them, so I decided to create one of my very own." My body went rigid as the man spoke. I understood why the organs were placed the way they were on the shelves. He was building a human with the organs he collected. "Can you tell what's missing?" he asked calmly as I checked my feet to make sure they were still on the path. I listened as a chair creaked and the shuffling of feet moved closer and closer. I closed my eyes, unable to take in any more. Tears trickled down my face as the fear paralyzed me. "I've always liked blondes." His hot sticky breath sank into my cheek as he whispered it. My eyes flew open and I ran. The yellow path was still easy to find, but it was slick with red splotches. I slid off the path and into the kitchen cabinets, hitting my head on the stove door. I didn't have time to feel the pain as I heard the man squeal with delight. His footsteps were quick and heavy. Still grasping the pitchfork, I flung it up in self-defense and felt it shudder as the man fell onto it. The plastic pitchfork had turned into a real one. I let out a scream as his hands flailed toward me, trying to grab my hair. He was too heavy for me to hold up, so I let go of it and watched him tumble to the floor. I scrambled to my feet, but my shoes slipped out from under me and I slid face first across the floor. I threw them off and made my way out of the kitchen, and to the path, on hands and knees. My heart was pounding in my chest and bile lurched up my esophagus. I looked toward the kitchen and saw the man hadn't moved. Did I just kill someone? Was this all part of the act? If it was part of the act, though, I shouldn't be in any real danger. Haunted houses were known for their pranks. That was how they worked. People were purposely hired to scare anyone brave, or stupid, enough to enter them. There was no point in leaving the path again to investigate it myself. I had to find a way out of here, or find Mr. Myers and beg him to let me out. I was not cut out for this. After the tears stopped falling, I stood up and took a few deep breaths. The realization that I was on my own hit me. My friends hadn't bothered to come find out why I had screamed. They didn't care if I was hurt or that I was scared. I had to keep moving. As I left the kitchen behind, I heard a soft moan. I turned back and watched as the man I thought I had killed slowly rested on one knee and moved into a standing position. He pulled the pitchfork out and dropped it on the floor where it clanged like metal. Without even glancing toward me, he sauntered off to the kitchen table and sat back down as though nothing had happened. Not caring to relive that part of the tour, I walked as quietly as I could, further into the house. I needed to look for clues on where to go next. Rounding the corner, I saw a sign on the wall. "You must first go up to get down." I needed to go upstairs next, but there were no stairs, just a long hallway with vintage wallpaper of red leaves spiraling in a downward motion. There were doors on either wall, but the path didn't lead to any of them and I was not willing to wander off. There had to be something I missed. I followed the path all the way to the end of the hall, where it ended. I touched the wall, looking for a secret passage or lever that was hidden away. When I couldn't find anything, I knocked on the wall thinking if it sounded hollow, There might be something behind it. Unfortunately, it was solid. I turned and walked back the way I came. I noticed one section of the wallpaper had the leaves going up and not down. This had to be it, but the path didn't stray from the middle of the hallway. Was it a test? My body shuddered at the thought of leaving the safety of the path. What other choice did I have, though? I would not go back to the kitchen of nightmares. I heard one of the doors creak open and I tensed at the sound. Finding the source, I saw a little boy staring out at me. "Push the orange one," he commented. Looking at the wall, I didn't see anything that was orange. I shook my head at him. "An orange what?" "It's hard to see, but it's there. It's an orange leaf that only looks slightly different." "What will happen?" I asked, finding my voice. "You'll go up," he smiled slightly, though it didn't touch his eyes. "Why are you helping me?" I asked softly. "Because I don't want you to get trapped here, too," the boy insisted and shut the door. "Hey, wait," I yelled as I ran over to the door. I forgot all about staying on the path as I pushed his door open and walked in. The room was decorated for a child who loved space. There were rocket ships painted on the wall and planets hung over the bed. When the little boy saw me, he forcefully pushed me toward the door. "This room is only safe for me," he screamed. "It's not safe for you. Stay on the path. Please, stay on the path." I let him push me out, but before I got back on the path, a horrendous wail bounced off the walls, causing me to drop to my knees. I looked back and the boy was tucked into a ball, covering his ears. "She's coming," he wailed. "You have to get upstairs before she gets here. My room will protect me and only me." Covering my ears, I left his room and made it back on the path. I moved down the hall as the wailing became louder. I stood up and found the part of the wall where the leaves went up, searching for the orange one. The sound grew louder and I felt like my eardrums were going to burst. Something wet dripped from my nose. Wiping it with my hand, I cringed at the sight of my blood. It was frying my brain. As my vision blurred, I saw a different colored leaf. It was higher than I could reach. I jumped, stretching my fingers, grasping toward the orange leaf. I missed. I scrambled back on the path and tried again. The leaf was too high. My head was pounding. Blood coated my vision, and when I pulled my hands from my ears, there was blood trickling from them too. I knew that the piercing wail would kill me if I didn't find a way out. Shouting in frustration, and I jumped again. My fingers only grazed it, but it was enough. A door slid open from the wall, and seeing the yellow path, I rushed in. The door slid firmly shut as I stumbled up the first few steps. The world around me was ringing. The wails mercifully stopped, but I heard nothing else for several minutes as I adjusted to the quietness of this new space. I didn't feel blood draining from ears, nose, or eyes anymore. I didn't have anything to clean my face with except for my dress, so I used it. No shoes and coated in blood on my face and dress, I looked more like a prop of the haunted house. The stairs twirled up higher than I thought they would, considering I started on the main level. When I got to the top, I noticed there was no door handle, which meant once I exited the safety of the closed-off stairwell, I wouldn't be able to get back in. "Jace," I heard Amber yell from beyond the door. "Geronimo," I silently whispered as I pushed the door open and went to find her. I don't know why I bothered, since she, nor Jace, had come to find me when I screamed out. Nevertheless, I followed the path in search of my friends. I found them in a bedroom. Amber didn't have her top on and Jace was naked from the waist down, his back flat on the bed. It wasn't hard to figure out what they had been doing. "Amber," I called. "What's wrong? Why aren't you on the path?" Amber looked over to me and recognition dawned on her. She ran over to me and grabbed me in a bear hug as she cried. "Oh, Alice. I don't know what happened." Jace stopped moving. We were having sex and then all of a sudden, he started spasming. I thought he was orgasming and I was really pissed because it was way too soon and I wasn't done yet. Then, his eyes rolled up to the ceiling and he stopped breathing. I gently unwrapped myself from her. "You look like hell," she remarked. I exhaled, too tired to get into why. "Amber, where is your shirt?" I asked gently. She sniffled and looked around. When she saw her shirt in the room by the bed, she went to grab it, but I pulled her back. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "You can't leave the path. There are things in here that want to harm us." "I need my shirt and I need to know if Jace is okay," she scoffed. Leaving the path, she pulled her cheerleader top on and scowled at Jace. "This isn't funny anymore," she cursed at him. "You can stop. I'm really scared, so, haha, okay?" Jace didn't move. I watched as Amber got closer to him. That's when I saw something under the bed. Its eyes were red and its fingers had claws as long as cutting knives. I hesitated, and by the time I reached her, the creature had slashed her legs. Blood spurted everywhere as she buckled and hit the floor. I quickly pulled her toward the path, but the creature grabbed her legs and she let out a blood-curdling scream. Shaking him off, we made it and watched as the creature looked around, as if it couldn't see us. Giving up, it turned back to the bed that Jace was lying on and started cutting into him with its sharp claws. Screaming, Amber fought to get to Jace to stop the carnage as I held her back. Slipping from my grip, she toppled headfirst into the room. Regaining her footing, she found the spear she had taken at the entrance and drove it into the creature's back. The beast wriggled and whirled. It lunged off the bed to the opposite side of Amber, clawing at the spear. Amber frantically pulled Jace's body from the bed. "Help me!" she yelled and I obeyed. I grabbed Jace's legs and she held his arms. He hit the floor with a loud thump. The creature turned to us, forgetting about the spear in its back. Lunging at Amber, she dropped Jace and ran from the room. I was left holding his feet and wondered, why? Why had I come in here when she asked? Why was I still holding on to a dead man? It was clear what had happened to him on the bed as I saw the mattress ripped to shreds beneath him with a pool of blood soaking the sheets. I looked up at the creature who eyed me hungrily, as the man in the kitchen had done. Whatever was going on in this house, it fed off scared humans, who had very little defenses. Dropping Jace, I grabbed the bat by the bed and swung it at the creature as it came after me with the spear still in its back. "Amber, help me!" I cried out. "Grab the spear and push down." Amber simply stared at me with wide eyes. She glanced between me, swinging the bat to the creature who easily deflected my attempts. With no sense of remorse, she turned from the room and ran. The wind was knocked from me by the betrayal. I had left the path to come help her when she called out to me, but she didn't do the same. She left. In my moment of being stunned and hurt, the creature was able to knock the bat from my hands. I fell backward and scuttled toward the open door. I wasn't going to make it to the path before it got me. I was dead and I knew it. As the creature bounded from the floor to try to land on me, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the grappling hook, and fired. It went through the creature's chest and hit the back wall. It slid down the rope that was still connected to the device in my hands. I dropped it and didn't wait to see if it too would come back to life and resume its original position under the bed. I tried catching my breath when I reached the yellow brick road. The realization that Amber had left me to die slammed into me. I sobbed hysterically as I felt utterly alone. A small part of me believed that no one came for me earlier because they were too far away to hear my scream. Now I knew that even if they had heard it, they wouldn't have come anyway. Braving the room once again, I pulled Jace's body to the safety of the path. He may not have done the same for me, but I didn't feel right leaving him in there when the monster reanimated again. I didn't believe this place was for a haunted house attraction anymore. This was a place for survival and sacrifice. The sacrifice was to the monsters that were trapped here that survived off of fear and human flesh. I intended to make it to the exit without becoming a victim. If I got out, I could bring the police and safely walk them through the murder house to find Jace's body. It was the least I could do. I found Amber down a winding path that brought us back to the main stairs that her and Jace took at the start of this ordeal. She was tucked in the fetal position, crying. Without a word, I looked for another clue. I knew that going back down the stairs would only start the maze over again. I would not go back to the beginning. I walked down the hallway that forked from the one we just came from. That one loops around back to this one, Amber sniffled. It's one big circle. Then you missed something, I screamed. She cried harder at my tone and I felt bad, but with no reason to. She abandoned me. My best friend abandoned me. I could not talk to her without hateful words flowing from my mouth, so I walked. I walked down the hallway and let it take me around the hall and back to where she was crying. I walked again and again looking for clues or a sign that told me what to do. I watched the patterns in the wallpaper. I followed the path and made sure it didn't lead off anywhere else. I tapped on the floors looking for a trapdoor when I finally noticed something. There was a large door with a handle that was different from the others. This handle had a curved design to grip, whereas the other handles were round. As I turned the knob to enter the room, Amber was right by my side. She winced and looked up at me sadly. "Can I come? I don't want to be alone with Jace's body," she pleaded. I nodded once and grabbed the door handle. Turning it, the floor gave way and we both fell through. Screaming as the light faded and the trap door silently closed, I cursed the fact that I had used the grappling hook too soon. My body thudded onto something hard and I could feel myself sliding down instead of free falling. I landed hard on Amber, who let out a whoosh of air as I did. I rolled off of her and inspected our surroundings. The light was too dim to make anything out. We had to be in the basement. Did that mean we were close to the exit? Had I followed the path correctly? I moaned into my hands in frustration. "Hello? Is someone there?" A panicked voice rang out. It was Parker. My heart fluttered knowing he was alive. "Parker?" Amber wailed as she too realized who it was. "Parker, Parker, Parker," she cried out to him over and over again. "I'm here, Amber," he yelled back. "Where is Jace? Is he with you?" Of course he would ask about Jace. No one ever asked about Alice. "No," she cried. "He's dead. This place is trying to kill us all. I wish Alice never suggested we come here." "This was your idea," I screamed at her. "I only suggested it because you complained to me the entire time we were getting ready for the night that you hated trick or treating and you wanted to come to this haunted house to impress Jace." "That's not true. Don't try to pin this on me. Jace's death is on your hands, not mine." No longer able to control my rage, I flung myself on her. We rolled over the floor until we landed on something soft and unmovable. I took myself off of Amber and looked in horror as Dara's body lay unmoving with her throat ripped out. Blood coated her entire costume from her neck to her feet. Amber screamed and I backed into a wall. "You found Dara," Parker guessed. "We weren't down here very long when things got weird. At first, we thought it was cool. There were bats flying around and strobe lights bounced around the path. Dara thought it was a vampire room and she wanted to explore. She pretended to be Buffy with a wooden stake on her tool belt, so went off the path and found a coffin. It was made of wood and sealed with iron chains. Dara took the chains off and opened it. The thing inside was not what vampires look like in movies. It was much worse. It was shaped like a human, but its features were wrong. Its limbs were too long and there were too many teeth. It had black eyes like a demon. Dara didn't stand a chance. The thing grabbed her neck and tore into her before I even took a breath. I followed Parker's voice and found him, but he turned away from me when I approached. "Parker," I whispered softly. "Don't come any closer, Alice," he stammered. "You can't see me like this. No one can." This was why I had fallen for Parker. Everyone else saw him as a playboy who had an image to keep up with, but I saw his soft side long before high school cliques were the only way of surviving. His heart was bigger than anyone realized. I knew Dara's death was affecting him more than he wanted to show. I placed my hand on his shoulder, hoping he knew that I was here for him. He turned to face me. The fear that I experienced in bursts all night long came flooding back to my body. I couldn't breathe as I looked into his eyes that should have been brown, but were now black. "Get away, Alice," he growled. "I won't let it be you. Anyone else but you." "What happened?" I choked out, holding back the tears. "When the vampire took Dara and started feeding on her, I grabbed the stake from her belt and stabbed it in the back. I must have hit my mark because it dropped her." A shiver went from his body, through the stake, and into me. I felt sick at first. I thought I was dying. I convulsed on the floor and called for help. "I heard you scream and I wanted to get to you, but I didn't have any control over my body. I think I died." I froze. My instincts were torn between running from him and comforting him. Amber leaned on me for support, though I doubted it was for sentimental reasons. "I'm thirsty," he rasped. "I know that whatever this thing is inside me, it wants me to feed. I know what it wants to feed on, too, and I can't do it. Please believe me. I don't want to do it." "Then you don't have to," I assured him. "Maybe if you don't feed, you can beat it?" Parker shook his head. "I don't think so, Alice. You've always seen the good in me, and that is why I love you." My heart caught in my throat. Tears formed as my head spun. I had dreamed about this day since I met Parker, but I had accepted these words would never be mine. "I love you too," I choked out. What was the point in denying it now? I watched him smile, but it was a sad smile. I knew what was coming. There was no chance of us being together. Not after all of this. "Run," he rasped as he lunged at Amber and I, grabbing me around the waist, he threw me down the path. "Follow it to the end. You're getting out of here. Don't come back." His face had turned cruel and his teeth shifted. There were too many in his mouth. His skin was pulled too tight around his already sculpted face. His skin stayed the warm brown it always was, but that too was fading. Holding Amber by the arm with his hand, he sank his teeth hungrily into her neck. Like watching a rabid animal eat its kill, he couldn't control his thirst. Just like when Amber and I escaped the creature upstairs, an invisible force field held him where he was. He was the new attraction. He could never leave this place. All of the monsters in this house were trapped within a room that was meant to torture them as much they hungered to torture us. Unable to look at him, I ran, following the path. I didn't look back as he yelled in agony after me. My vision blurred with tears, and when I remembered to look at where I was going, I nearly collided with a woman dressed in white. My feet tripped over each other as they fought to control the direction my body should go, and I landed hard on the concrete floor. Something snapped and I screamed. "Hello, Alice," said a woman dressed as a white witch. "I've been waiting for you." "Get away from me," I yelled. "Let me see your arm," she murmured softly and bent down to examine me. I winced at her touch, but let her put my arm in a makeshift sling as I sat listening to what used to be Parker. "My husband and I always know who will survive when they walk in the door," she chuckled, making light conversation as she worked. "You and your husband did this," I seethed. "How could you? My friends didn't deserve this." "Friends?" she asked. "You and I both know none of your companions were going to help you." I knew she was right, and I was too broken to stick up for any of them like a good friend should. "My husband and I do this every year to keep more people from being attacked. We travel from town to town, finding an abandoned house to fix up. Then we trap creatures who cross over on Halloween into a single place to prevent them from roaming free to hunt." My eyebrows knit together as I turned her words over in my head. "What about that man that attacked me in the kitchen? Or the little boy that was trapped in that room?" I asked. "Those weren't creatures. They were human." "The man was not human. He only appeared to be. You would have seen his true nature if you didn't get him with that pitchfork." "Nicely done, by the way. Of all the things that happened in this house," she was congratulating me on skewering someone or something with a pitchfork. "Unfortunately," she continued, "that little boy was in this house long before we were. Some creatures that pass through feed on humans and spirits. He will be set free once the night is over. The best we could do was keep him safe in his room." "Why bring people in here?" I asked, glaring into her eyes. "The creatures only have 24 hours to feed. It becomes a gluttonous rampage, but it doesn't take many lives to satisfy them, so the sacrifice is small in comparison. We don't like our job, but it's the one we have." "Can't you kill the creatures after you trap them?" "You saw what happens when you try. They reanimate and come back to life as though nothing had happened to them. We keep trying to rid this world of them, but all of our attempts have failed. Instead, we find the next hotspot year after year and keep trying, hoping that one day, we can." I looked away from her. I didn't want to know this place existed. I didn't want to exist anymore. Seeing that my hope was gone, the white witch helped me up and opened the exit door. I stumbled into the darkness. If it's any consolation, we always know who will survive because of the pureness of their heart. You listen to the warnings, You attempted to save your friends, even when they abandoned you, and you ventured off to save the little ghost boy, who couldn't be saved. You are a good person, Alice, and one day you will do great things. Wait, I shouted as she was pulling the door shut. What about the bodies? What if I get the police and bring them here? She smiled. The police help us do this because they know what other horrors await if we don't. They'll take care of a story about you and your friends. Follow the path to the road and there will be someone waiting for you. She shut the door, leaving me in the moonlight. Too numb to think anymore, I walked the path to the road where there was a police officer waiting to take me home. When the Halloween decorations start bleeding, am I going to be charged with murder? The detective sighed and did not answer. His eyes were tired, haunted. Just help us get to the bottom of this, he said. Okay, I answered. I'll do my best. I could hear the tremor in my voice. I hadn't stopped shaking since it happened. I'd had a strong drink to settle my nerves. It hadn't worked. Let's start at the beginning, said the detective. You were having a Halloween party. Yeah, I said. We do it every year. We take turns hosting, and the whole block participates. This year it was our turn. So you're the one who set up the decorations? Yeah, I said. Oh God, that sounds bad. But it wasn't just me, it was lots of people. I was mostly just supervising. Can you give me a list of who was involved? Yeah, it was I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. Just give me a moment to calm down, I can give you the list. That's okay, we can come back to that. Okay. So who was it that set up the scarecrow? It was me, I said. But I didn't I didn't do that. I set it up the night before. Someone must have come in during the night and... Oh God. The room swayed, and my breath came sharp and fast. My heart ratcheted up its pace to breakneck speed, and darkness began to close in around my vision. Hey, the detective said, just calm down. You're hyperventilating. Take long, calm breaths. I did as he said. My heart slowed, but the panic remained. Thanks, I said. Do you think you can keep going? He asked. Yeah, I said, just give me a moment. My body convulsed with tremors, but in a few minutes, they had settled down to a mild shaking in my hands. I gulped down a hard knot in my throat. Okay, I said. I'm ready. So, the scarecrow. The detective prompted. The word filled me with dread. The scarecrow, I repeated numbly. It's a Halloween tradition. The neighbors said as much. You destroy it every year? Yeah, I said. Usually it's filled with candy and straw. Like a piñata. The kids beat it with sticks, and everyone has a good time. I just don't understand, God, why would someone do that? It's too early to speculate, said the detective. Right now we are just gathering the facts. When did you notice that something was wrong? Well, right away I noticed that the scarecrow wasn't coming apart as easily as it should have been. But I just thought that I had put it together too well, so I grabbed a stick and... Yes? I took a swing. The detective leaned forward. And then what happened? My shoulders slumped. My mouth was cottony and dry. And then, I said, the scarecrow began to bleed. And... There was a pregnant pause. The detective's eyes bored into mine, willing me to continue. He said nothing, and I had to fill the silence. It fell over, I said. The hat came off, and we saw that it was a body. What happened then? The kids started screaming. One girl started it, the Oakley girl I think, and then they all went off. We, the other parents and I, we pulled them all away. We called the police and well, that's it. You know the rest. The detective scribbled his last note, and closed the fold-top notebook he'd been writing in. His eyes were hard, dull gray stone, impossible to read. When he spoke again his words were measured, careful. His voice was soft. What interests me, Mr. Johnson, he said, is that you haven't asked about your wife. The question caught me completely off guard. My wife? I said. She's out of town. Oh God, she's going to freak when she finds out what happened. She hates the block Halloween party enough as is. Your wife is out of town? Prodded the detective. The question poked a fresh wound. Yes, I said, forgetting my fear in a moment of irritation. She and my son are spending the holiday with her parents in Virginia. That seems strange, the detective said. A family spending a holiday apart. I got the feeling he knew something more than he was letting on. Have you talked to her? I said. I'd like to hear your side. My wife and I are going through a rough patch right now, I said. But I don't see why this is relevant. It's our job to gather all the information, he said. Then we can decide what is and is not relevant. Why was your wife not spending the holiday with you? I sighed. I wasn't proud of it, but I was getting flustered. I could feel hot blood rising to my face. We're separated, I said. Why is that? It's personal. Your wife said that it was related to infidelity. So you have talked to her? Yes. Fine, I said. You know, I cheated on my wife. I destroyed our family. It's all my fault. Now I've had a hell of a day, so if you don't mind, can you please tell me what the fuck this has to do with anything? The detective paused. He spoke softly. Your wife is in police custody, Mr. Johnson. What? I am sorry to have to tell you this, he said. But she has rendered a full confession. A full confession for what? What the hell are you talking about? It happens occasionally in cases of separation, he said. One party feels the need to punish the other. Unfortunately, the children are sometimes used as a tool to that end. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The room swam. Bile rose in my throat. Oh God, I gasped. Oh God, no. I am afraid we have positively identified the remains as belonging to your son, Ben, he said. The scream died in my throat. I blacked out. In deep Appalachia, Halloween night comes with rules. I've lived my entire life in a holler on the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, deep in the mountains of Appalachia. It's a place so remote most folks don't even know it exists on a map. Just a handful of families, and dense, unforgiving woods. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here. It's a test. My family, and the others who've lived here long enough to know, follow a set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition. It's survival. Those who didn't follow the rules didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. Our rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific, with reasons rooted in events we don't talk about. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time, when people came to these mountains from Scotland and still believed in the old ways. Whether it's spirits, or something else that's out there, or things just too old to name, Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death. And each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through till morning. The first time I broke a rule, I learned why they exist. And I'll never forget it. Every October, around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge. We lived by them. My family took them seriously, and not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. No. These rules were for everyone. Break one, and you'd put us all in danger. Here's how they go. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. If you hear a single, hard knock, open the door, but do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving to shut the door. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a wide-brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. If a candle is burning in the window of the old, abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors, no matter what. These rules didn't exist for no reason. They were handed down because bad things had happened. People vanished, people died, and strange things occurred. That's just how it was. I remember one specific year, years back, when Halloween night fell on a full moon. The air felt different, charged. My dad had a sense for when things were going to be bad. You could just feel it in the holler, thick in the air, like something breathing down your neck. Dad told us to get all the preparations done early. Salt the windows now, he instructed, standing by the door, his face tight with worry. We're not waiting for the chains, each windowsill and at the front and back door thresholds. My brother was baking bread, already anticipating rule number 2, the one we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact with whatever knocked, whatever stood on the other side of that door. We never knew who or what it was, but we knew if you didn't offer bread, or if you dared to look, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The bread was cooling on the counter, its smell filling the kitchen. The fire was lit, burning low, and a 12-gauge lay across Dad's lap like it always did on Halloween. Isaac, my younger brother, sat closest to the window, glancing out every now and then. We had about 3 hours before sunset. The rules were clear, everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part. The longer we sat there, the more anxious we became. Did we use enough salt this year? Isaac asked quietly. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, gripping the gun tighter. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark. A single knock, slow and deliberate. Isaac and I froze, staring at the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back and be quiet. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. It was time to follow Rule 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of bread from the counter, freshly baked, still warm. He walked to the door, resting one hand on the knob. "Remember," he said, his voice low and steady, "don't look." He opened the door just wide enough to slip the basket through the crack, his eyes focused on the floor. The warm smell of the bread wafted out, and I could hear a faint shuffling on the porch. Whoever, or whatever it was out there. I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare look. Dad held the basket out, his hand shaking slightly. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound, no movement, and then, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps retreating from the porch. He waited until they faded completely, then shut the door quietly, locking it tight. Isaac let out a breath. "Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why do we have to wait for the knock?" Dad's face was pale, and his eyes were hard. "We have to wait for the knock. And if we don't answer the knock, it'll come in." We thought it was over. We had followed Rule 2 to the letter, and for a moment, it seemed like things were quiet. But here, nothing stays quiet for long on Halloween. Isaac was the first to notice him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where the trees meet the clearing. He was tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he was there, watching. Isaac gasped, pointing. "It's him," he whispered, voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. He knew. We all did. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. Not for more than a second. I glanced, just enough to confirm he was there. A tall, dark figure, almost blending into the shadows of the trees, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. I looked away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. We got away from the doors and windows of the house, and sat huddled in the living room, the fire our only light. Outside, the man in the hat stood at the tree line, unmoving as the night crept on. It wasn't until after midnight that we heard the chains. At first, it was faint, a metallic clinking that seemed distant, almost like it could have been the wind. But it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains being dragged across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face turned pale. He shot me a look, wide-eyed and terrified. "The salt," he whispered. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up slowly, trying to control the tremor in my legs. I circled the house, inspecting every window and doorframe. The salt lines were intact. Nothing had disturbed them. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer, but we didn't dare open the door. We didn't dare look. We stayed inside, sitting together in the flickering light of the fire, listening to the sound of the chains until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone. The chains had stopped. But as the morning light seeped through the shutters, I glanced toward the old Anderson cabin up the hill, and there it was. A single candle still burning in the window. The rules are clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions. No excuses. Even with the sun beginning to shine and the birds beginning to chirp, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal fear. We have to wait until the candle goes out before we can go outside, before the night is truly over. And that's how it goes here. The rules aren't just there to be followed, they're there to keep you alive. And if you're smart, you don't ask questions. Sometimes, it's better not to know. Halloween here had always been terrifying, but last year was different. It wasn't just the usual unease, or the normal anxiety that came with the setting sun. It almost felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older, his movements slower, his hands a little less steady. We all knew it, but no one said anything. We just followed the rules like always, hoping that would be enough. We spent the day in preparation, salting the windows, baking the bread, the usual. Isaac and I were jittery, pacing around, double-checking everything. With my dad getting older, we felt a greater pressure to take it upon ourselves to prepare. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the last rays of the sun. By the time dusk fell, the fire was burning low, and the house sat in darkness. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The basket of bread, fresh out of the oven, sat next to him. We all waited, our hearts pounding in the silence. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure in the hat or hear the drag of chains. And then it came. A single knock, loud and deliberate. Dad stood up, just like every other year. "Stay put," he muttered, picking up the basket with his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Isaac and I exchanged a nervous glance as Dad approached the door. As always, I stared at the floor, focusing on the sound crackling fire, and trying to block out the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. He opened the door a crack, just enough to push the basket through without seeing whatever waited on the other side. But this time, something went wrong. As Dad leaned forward, he knocked the basket against the doorframe, and lost his grip. The bread tumbled out, scattering across the porch. The sudden movement, the noise, without thinking, I looked up. I looked at it. And I saw it. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I could name. It stood hunched over, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was sunken, like a skull with pale white skin pulled tight over it, and its eyes were wild, and wide, too wide, like it didn't have eyelids. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, a black, gaping hole that emitted a horrible, deafening wail. It was a sound I had never heard before, like metal scraping against stone, but worse. It drilled into my skull, making my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could react, before I could even scream, the thing lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing my dad by the collar. In one terrifyingly quick motion, it yanked him off the porch, dragging him toward the woods. The sound of his body scraping against the ground, his muffled cries, and the creature's horrible wail all blurred together into a scene of pure terror. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac yelled, bolting for the door. I followed, my legs shaking, and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran out into the cold night air, toward the edge of the woods where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it. The candle. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac yelled, bolting for the door. I followed, my legs shaking, and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran out into the cold night air, toward the edge of the woods where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it. The candle. A single flickering light in the window of the old Anderson cabin. My blood ran cold. We had come outside when the candle was burning. I grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him to a stop. "Wait," I whispered, voice shaking. "The cabin." As if on cue, the door of the cabin suddenly flew open with a loud crash, as if something unseen was about to come storming out. Something angry. Something that should not have been awakened. "We have to go," I shouted, dragging Isaac back toward our house. We scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The shotgun was still on the floor by Dad's chair, but it felt useless. What good would it do against something like that? But the night was far from over. We huddled in the living room, terrified, waiting for the next rule to break. Isaac was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. I stared at the door, half expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. The chains came next. We heard them clattering on the ground, dragging closer and closer. I grabbed the bag of salt, getting ready to double-check the lines of salt we had placed down earlier. The chains dragged right up to the front door, the metallic clinking echoing in the silence. I could hear it just outside, scraping against the wooden steps of the porch. But I knew the salt would hold. It always did. Or, so I thought. Isaac was the first to notice it. We had forgotten to resalt the front door threshold after going outside. The wind from the open door had disturbed our salt line. Just as I was about to rush toward the door to resalt it, I heard the chains, and a creaking against the door. It sounded as though a heavy weight was slowly leaning against it. I knew we didn't have time. I began to back away, motioning to Isaac to go to the bedroom. Isaac screamed as the door burst open. We ran into the back bedroom, hearts pounding, breaths coming in ragged gasps. I quickly salted in front of the door to the bedroom and checked the windows. "It's in the house," I whispered. I could feel it, a presence, something cold and malevolent, creeping through the house toward us. I don't know how long we waited, or how long we listened to the chains pacing back and forth through our house. Eventually, we heard them go back outside. Slowly, we left the bedroom, and quietly closed and locked the front door. I placed a fresh line of salt in front of the door and breathed a sigh of relief. We were safe, for now, and then we heard it again. A knock. But not the single knock. And not the 3 knocks. This was something new, something that didn't fit the rules. It was a rapid, frantic pounding, as if whatever was out there wanted in, now. My heart stopped. The rules didn't cover this. Isaac looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. Whatever was out there was angry, angrier than anything I had ever felt before. "We just wait," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "We wait until daylight." The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every minute felt like an hour, every sound made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't sleep. We didn't dare move from the living room. We huddled together in front of the fire, clutching the shotgun like it was our last hope, and quietly crying over the loss of our father. The pounding on the door never stopped. The chains outside the house dragged back and forth, a constant reminder of the horror that waited just beyond the walls. And through it all, the candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, flickering in the distance like a beacon of death. But somehow, we made it. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the sound stopped. The pounding ceased. The chains fell silent. The candle in the cabin flickered out. We had survived another year. Barely. But Dad never came back. Halloween in our holler had always been a test. But last year, it wasn't enough. Breaking the rules cost my dad his life, and everything is different. And I can't shake the feeling that this Halloween will be worse.